It was supposed to be a routine tragedy, an unexpected death that left behind a grieving widow, a man found lifeless in his own home, a wife devastated, making arrangements to lay him to rest. In Cherokee County, Georgia, the case barely made the news. A local attorney gone too soon, a simple cause of death, a funeral without delay, a cremation that left nothing behind. It was all over in a matter of days. But time has a way of revealing what the flames could not erase. 6 months later, an anonymous tip, a reopened investigation, and a single piece of evidence, overlooked, dismissed, buried in paperwork, would bring authorities back to the case. What they found turned whispers into accusations, suspicion into certainty. Because this wasn't just a grieving wife putting her husband to rest, this was something else entirely. Did she really believe the truth would never surface? That question would never be asked? That no one would ever look twice? Tonight, we uncover the case that left Cherokee County, Georgia, questioning everything they thought they knew about the woman who moved too quickly to turn her husband to ash. It started with a phone call, a man found unresponsive, a woman's voice on the other end of the line, steady but urgent, telling authorities that her husband had suffered a terrible accident. First responders arrived at the home in Cherokee County, Georgia, to find Gary Farris, once a respected attorney, now motionless. The cause of death? A medical emergency, they were told. A tragic fall. Nothing more. The funeral was swift, too swift. Within 48 hours, Gary Farris was reduced to ash. No second autopsy, no lingering questions. Just a widow, grieving, standing beside an urn that now held what was left of her husband. For most, that would have been the end. A tragedy closed and buried the man himself. But 6 months later, an unearthed report changed everything, because someone had looked closer. Someone had seen what others missed, and what they found sent investigators back to a case they thought was already solved. Melody Farris, the woman who had played the part of the heartbroken wife, was about to find herself at the center of a storm that would force an entire town to ask a question no one had dared to before. Had they been mourning the wrong person? Tonight we go back to the beginning, to the day a man lost his life, and the truth nearly disappeared with him. Before we continue, we want to hear from you. What do you think really happened in this case? Was it a tragic accident, or is there more to the story? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you love in-depth, true crime investigations like this, make sure to hit that like button. It really helps more people discover these stories. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a case that will leave you questioning everything. The call came in late that evening. A man had been found unconscious near his home in Cherokee County, Georgia. His wife was the one who called it in. Her voice was steady, almost rehearsed. She told authorities that Gary Farris, a well-known attorney, had suffered a medical emergency. Paramedics arrived to find his body still warm, the air thick with the acrid scent of smoke. There was no struggle, no sign of a break-in. Just a man whose life had ended in a way that seemed, at first, tragically simple. According to the official report, the cause of death was straightforward. He had suffered a sudden medical episode, lost his balance, and fallen too close to an open flame. It was ruled an accident, a tragic misstep, nothing more. But if that were true, why did his wife insist on cremation so quickly? Less than 48 hours later, before anyone could ask questions, before an autopsy could be fully examined, before his family had time to process the loss, Gary Farris was gone, reduced to ashes. The case, as far as officials were concerned, was over. At first, no one questioned Melody Farris. Those who knew her described her as heartbroken, a devoted wife, shattered by an unimaginable loss. But others whispered something different. that her grief seemed thin, that her tears came too easily, too perfectly, and that when no one was looking there was something else in her eyes, something harder to explain. For months the whispers faded, the case had been closed, the paperwork filed away. But what no one knew, what no one could have expected, was that somewhere buried in a forgotten corner of a report, there was a single detail waiting to be uncovered. A single discovery that would bring investigators back to Cherokee County, Georgia, and turn a closed case into something far more disturbing. For 6 months there was silence. 6 months later, Gary Farris was gone, his remains reduced to nothing but ash, his case filed away as just another tragic accident. His wife had mourned, friends had moved on, and the authorities had long since turned their attention elsewhere. But in a quiet forensic lab, miles away from Cherokee County, Georgia, something remained. A small, overlooked fragment, a piece of Gary that had been taken before the fire consumed everything. A tissue sample preserved, not by suspicion but by routine. A mere formality. Until now. When forensic specialists revisited the sample, they found something no one had expected. Something that should not have been there. Something that changed everything. Lodged deep within the remaining tissue was a bullet. A bullet that no fire could erase. A bullet that told a story no one had been willing to consider. Gary Farris had not died from a tragic fall. He had not collapsed from a sudden medical emergency. Someone had pulled a trigger. And suddenly the timeline, the rushed cremation, the unwavering insistence that his death was an accident, no longer made sense. Investigators returned to Melody Farris, the grieving widow who had been so eager to put her husband's death behind her. This time they had questions, and this time her answers didn't come so easily. In the first interview, she was composed. She repeated the story they had heard before. He fell. He lost consciousness. It was a tragedy, nothing more. The second time, there were details she hadn't mentioned before, that he had health problems, that she never questioned what happened that night. But by the third interview, something had changed. The pauses were longer. The tone was different. Detectives watched as Melody Farris, the woman who had confidently insisted her husband's death was an accident, now hesitated over the very details she had once been so sure of. And then came the physical evidence. The lab reports told a different story. Gunpowder residue, traced back to the very clothes Melody had been wearing that night. A life insurance policy, one worth more than $1 million, that had been altered just months before Gary's death. And then, perhaps most damning of all, a grainy piece of surveillance footage. Melody, alone, in the dead of night, discarding something deep in the woods. A case once closed had been ripped wide open, and as investigators in Cherokee County, Georgia, pieced together the truth, one question remained. Had Melody Farris really fooled them all? For months, she lived her life as if nothing had changed. Melody Farris walked through the quiet streets of Cherokee County, Georgia, with the poise of a woman untouched by tragedy. She went to the store, she met with friends, she played the role of the grieving widow with practiced ease. And for a while it worked. But behind the walls of the Cherokee County Sheriff's Office, a different story was unfolding. Investigators had pieced together a case that could no longer be ignored. The forensic evidence, the inconsistencies, the insurance policy, it all led to one undeniable conclusion. Melody Farris had more to explain than she had let on. On a quiet morning, just as the sun was rising over Cherokee County, Georgia, police arrived at her doorstep. This time, they weren't there to ask questions. They were there to take her in. Neighbors watched in stunned silence as officers led Melody out of her home in handcuffs. A woman who had spent months insisting she had nothing to hide, now at the center of one of the most chilling cases the county had ever seen. The news spread quickly. Small-town gossip turned into statewide headlines. The woman who had so eagerly laid her husband to rest was now standing trial for his murder. Inside the courtroom, the tension was suffocating. The prosecution wasted no time in painting a damning picture. Melody had not only taken her husband's life, they argued, but she had done so with calculation, covering her tracks with fire, with deception, with a mask of grief so convincing that for 6 months she had fooled everyone. She shot him, she burned the body, and she rushed the cremation before anyone could ask questions, the lead prosecutor declared. This wasn't an accident. It was a crime designed to erase all evidence of what she had done. The defense, however, had a different story to tell. They insisted that Melody had simply acted out of shock, that she had followed the advice of doctors, of funeral directors, of those who told her it was time to move on. A tragic misunderstanding, they called it. Nothing more. But it wasn't just the arguments that held the courtroom captive. It was the witnesses. A forensic expert took the stand first, unwavering in his testimony. The bullet wound, he stated, could not have been self-inflicted. The room fell silent. Then a former friend of Melody's stepped forward, their voice calm but deliberate. She joked about getting rid of Gary months before this happened, they admitted. We all thought she was just blowing off steam. We never thought she actually meant it. Through it all, Melody sat motionless. No outbursts, no visible emotion. A woman who had once convinced an entire community of her sorrow now sat before a jury that wasn't so easily swayed. And then, after weeks of testimony, of evidence, of whispers that filled the hallways of the courthouse, the verdict was read. Guilty. For the first time since her arrest, Melody Farris reacted. Her breath hitched, her shoulders stiffened. And then, as the weight of the words sank in, her composure finally broke. Tears, long absent, now fell freely. But whether they were tears of remorse, of regret, or simply the realization that her freedom had just been taken away, no one could say for certain. The trial was over. The verdict had been delivered. And yet, for many, the answer still felt incomplete. A husband was dead, a wife was convicted, but the deeper questions remained. What really happened on that night in Cherokee County, Georgia, and perhaps more chillingly, had Melody Farris acted alone? In the weeks that followed the trial, theories began to emerge. Whispers in quiet conversations, speculation in online forums, questions that refused to fade. Some believed Melody had been driven by money, an opportunity too large to ignore. Others wondered if there had been something more. A secret lover, a desperate attempt to escape a failing marriage, a long-buried resentment that had finally surfaced in the most violent way possible. True crime communities on Reddit dissected every detail, analyzing inconsistencies in her story, pointing out things that hadn't quite added up. If she had planned this murder so meticulously, why had she overlooked the one piece of evidence that would unravel it all? The bullet lodged in his ribcage. A mistake? Or something else? Some even questioned whether Melody had intended to kill Gary at all. Had there been someone else involved? Someone who knew what happened that night but had managed to slip away unnoticed? In Cherokee County, Georgia, the case remained a subject of hushed conversations. Some who had once stood by Melody now spoke about her in quiet, uneasy tones. Others still refused to believe she was capable of such a crime, arguing that the evidence, though damning, still left room for doubt. But there was one undeniable truth. Gary Farris was gone, and the woman who had vowed to love him for life had instead ensured his life came to an end. The house they had shared sat empty, a silent monument to a tragedy no one saw coming. The echoes of that fateful night lingered in every unsolved question, in every theory that refused to die. The courtroom had given its verdict. But for those who followed the case, for those who sifted through every detail, there was one haunting realization that remained. Perhaps the full truth had never come to light. Some crimes reveal themselves in an instant, a single mistake, a witness in the right place at the right time, an undeniable piece of evidence that ties everything together. But others take longer. Sometimes the truth doesn't surface right away. Sometimes it takes months, even years, for the lies to unravel, for the deception to crack, for justice to catch up with those who thought they had escaped it. Gary Farris lost his life on a quiet summer night in Cherokee County, Georgia. A tragic accident, his wife insisted, a loss she mourned, a death she was desperate to put behind her. But time has a way of revealing what people try to bury. And in this case, time was the only reason the truth ever came to light. But even now, with Melody Farris convicted, the case continues to linger in the minds of those who followed it. Did she act alone? Had this been planned for months, or had something gone horribly wrong that night? And perhaps the most unsettling question of all, if investigators hadn't stepped in when they did, would she have ever been caught at all? The courtroom has spoken. The evidence has been laid out. But what do you think? Was justice truly served? Or is there still more to this story waiting to be uncovered? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this case as gripping as we did, be sure to check out our other true crime stories, each one a chilling reminder that truth is often stranger than fiction. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss another case that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew.